This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Ukraine's much anticipated counteroffensive has finally arrived. After a brief probing attack earlier this week, which successfully pushed the Russians back around Bakhmut, it looked like the main thrust of Ukraine's counterattack has arrived in Zaporizhzhia oblast. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what happened in Bakhmut, what's happening in Zaporizhzhia, and where Ukraine might go next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, before we get into it, we said in our last video that we know that the Ukrainian armed forces have requested operational silence, but nothing in this video violates that or could put Ukrainian troops at risk. All the information here is coming from Russian Telegram channels, and it's stuff that Russian military bloggers, let alone the Kremlin, are already aware of. So, with that out the way, let's start with the first place where Ukraine is making real progress: Bakhmut. After nearly a year of non-stop fighting, and at the cost of thousands of lives, the Russian army, or more specifically the Wagner Group, finally captured the town in mid-May. A couple of days before their retreat, the Ukrainians pushed back along Bakhmut's north and south flanks. At the time, we suggested that this might be a counter-offensive of sorts, but in retrospect, it looks like it was more about allowing those troops still in the centre of Bakhmut a safe passage out of the city. And, well, it worked. Ukraine's withdrawal from Bakhmut was a relatively orderly affair, and they were able to avoid being encircled, which would have been the worst-case scenario from Ukraine's perspective. However, in the past couple of days, as part of their much-anticipated counteroffensive, Ukraine has restarted its attack along Bakhmut's flanks, with some success. To the south of Bakhmut, it looks like the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back a couple of kilometres, and now have reached Klitschivka, a tiny suburb that the Russians took in late January. To the north, it looks like the Ukrainians have reached Bukiivka, at least according to Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, who claimed this on June the 5th. In more bad news for the Kremlin, Ukraine's success around Bakhmut has restarted the long-standing feud between Prigozhin and the Russian Minister of Defense. Wagner troops have been steadily replaced by regular Russian army troops over the past week or so, and Prigozhin is furious that, as he sees it, the second Wagner withdrew from Bakhmut, the Russians started losing territory. Prigozhin has also attacked the Russian Ministry of Defense for failing to defend Belgorod, saying that Wagner would defend the region if the Russians didn't, and even apparently called for Russia's Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov to be executed by firing squad. To give you a sense of quite how bad relations are, in just the last couple of days, Wagner has accused the Russian army of mining their routes out of Bakhmut, and earlier this week, Wagner forces literally took a Russian colonel prisoner because he'd apparently been shooting at Wagner troops. There are now reports that Shoigu is planning to arrest Prigozhin sometime soon, which would be, well, interesting, because it's not really clear how this would even happen. After all, it's not like the Russian army could just waltz into Wagner HQ. Prigozhin has also started a parallel spat with Ramzan Kadyrov and other Chechen leaders, who also have semi-autonomous private military companies operating in Ukraine. As Wagner was pulling out of Bakhmut, Prigozhin implied that Kadyrov's Chechen forces would be unable to hold the city, sparking a furious reaction from Kadyrov's lieutenants, one of whom challenged Prigozhin to a duel. Anyway, you get the idea. While Ukraine's gains around Bakhmut have been relatively modest, which is sort of unsurprising given that we're less than a week into the counteroffensive, they've been enough to spook Prigozhin and exacerbate his feud with other factions within the Russian army. So that's Bakhmut. The other place worth talking about is Zaporizhzhia. When we did our last video on Ukraine's counteroffensive on Wednesday, we suggested that Ukraine's main counteroffensive was still to come, and that, at the time, Ukraine was performing what are known as probing attacks. Probing attacks are limited attacks that are less about making significant territorial gains and more about finding weak spots in your enemy's defences. There are two reasons that we thought these were probing attacks. First, they were equally spread out across the entire front line, and second, they didn't involve Ukraine's most advanced tech, like Leopard tanks. However, in the past couple of days or so, Ukraine has concentrated their attacks along the front lines in Zaporizhzhia oblast, and open source intelligence suggests that Ukraine has also committed a significant fraction of their best tech here, including not just Leopard tanks, but also American-made Bradley armoured vehicles. While it's too early to say for sure, as things stand, it does look like Zaporizhzhia is going to be the main theatre for Ukraine's counteroffensive. Again, it's hard to say anything with too much confidence here, given Ukraine's operational silence and the uncertain nature of open source intelligence. But from what we've seen, there are basically three axes of attack in Zaporizhzhia. First, in the west, a Ukrainian force is trying to advance along the left bank of the Dnipro, from Kamyansky towards Vasilivka. In the east, another Ukrainian force is trying to move south from Huliopol towards Polohi. However, the main drive seems to be in between these two, with a large Ukrainian force trying to push south from Orkiv down towards Tokmak. Taking Tokmak would be a massive strategic success for the Ukrainians, because it would put a serious strain on Russia's logistics operation in the south. At the moment, Russian troops in Melitopol and Kherson are supplied via a rail line, which runs from Russian-occupied territory in the east through Tokmak down to Melitopol and then Crimea. If Ukraine were to capture Tokmak, then Russia could still supply its troops via roads running along the coast or from Crimea. But this wouldn't be ideal from a Russian perspective, especially given the Russian army's outsized reliance on rail networks. However, reaching Tokmak wouldn't be easy. It's still 35 kilometers away from Orkiv, and Zaporizhzhia is where Russia has the densest fortifications. Presumably because they know that if Ukraine breaks through here, they could eventually sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Nonetheless, if Ukraine does reach Tokmak, there are two places it could go next: Melitopol or Mariupol. Both would sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea, but Melitopol seems more likely for a couple of reasons. First, it's just closer. Second, it's further from Russia's main supply points. And third, if the Ukrainians make it to Molochansk, a couple of kilometers southwest of Tokmak, then they could advance to at least halfway to Melitopol via the T0401 road, while using the Molochna River as a natural defence for their right flank. For the moment, however, Ukraine's immediate priority will be reaching Tokmak. It's too early to say how things are going or whether this is likely, but we'll doubtless release a video on this next week, so subscribe to stay updated. When making videos like this, we rely on a ton of data analysis to interpret military strategy and economic objectives. That kind of analysis isn't just crucial for our jobs. As our world becomes more driven by AI and data, your job will likely require more analytical skills too. Fortunately, you don't have to be left behind if you jump onto Brilliant. Brilliant is the STEM learning platform which can teach you all the skills you'll need in an increasingly digital workplace, from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, and more. That means that the progression of tech and AI doesn't need to be intimidating. With easy-to-understand and interactive programs, you can level up your skills by spending just a few minutes a day on Brilliant. And you'll want to. Their programs have been directly built around the principles of active learning, so they're fun, interactive, and help you learn by doing. Plus, with new courses added all the time, there's no way you're getting left behind. To try everything Brilliant has to offer, free for a full 30 days, click on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. As always, thanks to Brilliant, and thanks for your support.